which is finance. And we have our Oak Harbor Financial Primer Part 1B. And for this today, we have our Finance Director, David Goldman. Mr. Goldman?
All right, good afternoon. David Goldman, Finance Director. So this is Part 1B of the Finance and Budget Primer. This is a continuation of the revenues that we started with Part 1A. And with that, let me get right into it. So the contents of today's primer will include other taxes, intergovernmental revenue and other revenues, and we'll end with resources. So the next tax to go over is the city's utilities tax. The utility tax is the city's third largest source of general fund revenue. For the biennial of 2021 to 2022, the budget was $5.7 million. It's imposed as a percent of the total bill on the following. It's a 6% tax on water, sewer, solid waste, storm drain, electric, gas, telephone, and cellular phone service. There's also an additional 0.25% tax on water, sewer, and solid waste, and those funds, about $50,000 a year, are used for creative arts purposes. This is how Oak Harbor's utility tax compares to some comparable cities. Oak Harbor is the third row from the bottom. And like I mentioned, it varies between 6 and 6.25. Other cities' utility tax rates are located in the middle column here. And the details of those rates are on the right. And the 2022 budgeted amount is located right here. This is the amount of revenue that these utility tax rates generate. As you can see, Oak Harbor generated $2.7 million. These are actual figures, not budgeted figures. Next, we have a business and occupations tax. This is not imposed by Oak Harbor. Business and occupation taxes are one of four.
Mr. Goldman.
David, could you go back to that last slide for a second? I'm getting a little confused. You said we have a $5.7 million income from utility tax, but then this diagram shows 2.6.
2 years.
Oh, so
this is over
on
2
the
years.
biennial. And then Anacortes, which is a much smaller population, and we're 6.25% tax, and they're 7% tax. And I know for a fact Anacortes' utility rates are not double of the city of Oak Harbor, but is that a correct figure for the city of Anacortes?
Yeah, this came right off the state auditor's website.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Councilor Hoffmeyer has a question.
Real quick, while we're on this page here, the 0.25% water, sewer, solid waste tax there. I see on this list here, we seem to be the only one with that. Is that indicative statewide of many other municipalities, or is it the exception that these cities here don't have that?
We just looked at these comparable cities. We weren't able to look at all 200 plus cities. It would just take too long. But yeah, we didn't find that broken out specifically in their ordinances. But for all we know, some of these funds that are collected could end up going there. It's just not broken out specifically in the ordinance.
Okay, yeah, this list here was just leaving me a little curious. Thank you.
Sure. Are there any other questions, or can we move on to the next slide? All right, thank you.
Go ahead and move on.
So the next slide is the business and occupations tax, or B&O tax. This is not imposed by Oak Harbor. It is one of the four main revenue sources available to cities. Those four main revenue sources being property tax, sales tax, the previous utility tax, and the business tax. The rules for this are the rates must be the same within a single business class. For example, the rate must be the same within all the manufacturing type industries, and the rate must be the same within all the retail type industries, and so on. But you can have different rates between those classes. Rates may not exceed 0.2% of gross receipts, and the imposition of this tax does not require voter approval, but it may be subject to a referendum. So looking at those same comparable cities, we found three of those cities do impose the B&O tax rate. Bainbridge Island, Bremerton, and Port Townsend. This is the rate, varies between 0.1 and 0.2. And it's applied to, there's some minimum thresholds that the business has to exceed in order to pay the tax. And you can see these thresholds located here on the right. The state auditor did not have any data as far as revenues go for 2020, but it was recently enacted. So maybe in the future they'll have updated information to show what kind of revenues Burlington is generating from that B&O tax. Are there any questions on this? All right, moving on. Real estate excise tax. This is levied on sales of real estate and includes a city and a state component. The state's rate is graduated and depends on the value of the of the property that's being sold. And then cities generally levy the full 0.5 rate, split into two different categories: REIT 1, 0.25%, and REIT 2, 0.25%. It generally must be spent only on capital projects specified in the city's capital facilities plan, with some exceptions. And for the biennial, the amount budgeted was approximately $1.8 million. Here we have the lodging tax. This is levied on hotels, motels, and short-term rentals. These are the revenues that are subject to the LTAC committee's recommendations. It's a total of a 4% tax. 2% of it is a credit against the state's base 6.5% sales tax, and there's an additional 2% on top of the 6.5%, and that is how the 4% is calculated. For the biennial, about $500,000 was budgeted from those taxes. These taxes must be used for tourism promotion or acquisition/operation of tourism facilities, to include tourism marketing and operations of special events and festivals, operations and capital expenditures of tourism facilities owned and operated by the city, and operations of tourism facilities owned and operated by nonprofits. And cities must establish a lodging tax advisory committee, or LTAC, to review applications and make funding recommendations to City Council. And we have some other smaller revenue type taxes. We have our gambling tax. For the biennial, the total is about $13,000. Our tax rates, the City of Oak Harbor's tax rates, are located to the right. The Association of Washington Cities put out a survey, and the average tax rate from the survey is on the left. So you can see the average taxes as compared to Oak Harbor's tax rates. Next slide are intergovernmental revenues. This includes grants and government assistance from the federal government and the state government, also local government, such as the county, and also state shared revenues, which are formula-based. The motor vehicle fuel tax, the CAPRON refunds, which only Island County and San Juan County receive, some liquor and marijuana taxes, and multimodal funds and increased motor vehicle fuel tax. The total over the 2 years is about $8.4 million. And we have a number of other revenues. We have the biggest one is charges for services. That is the charges for services for our water, wastewater, solid waste, and storm drain and marina. Proprietary funds, also senior services, and it also includes internal service fund charges. License and permits is another major category. Fines and forfeitures. And we also have miscellaneous, and we have slides for each one of these coming up. But for the 2021-2022 biennial, the budget was $73.5 million for all these other revenues. So business licenses, the City Council recently adopted a flat $40 per business license and $0 for nonprofits, governmental, and religious organizations. We went over some other structure options that the City Council might want to weigh in the spring of next year. We'll have more information as folks do the renewal on the state's website for the first time. We'll be able to capture some more information and be able to run some additional scenarios for the City Council to consider. The total amount budgeted for 21 and 22 is about 110,000. Next, we have building and planning permits. These are regulatory in nature and based on the cost of services. Per RCW, cities can collect permit fees to cover the cost of processing applications, inspecting and reviewing plans, or preparing detailed statements. And per the MRSC, the guiding principle for these fees and charges is that they may be set at a level that recovers all the direct and indirect costs with the activity, including the administrative overhead. So per the chart on the right, in the red, we have the actual cost of development services, and then we have the budgeted amounts of development services. And in the blue, we have the revenue associated with those costs for each one of these years. Are there any questions? All right, moving on to the next slide. Franchise fees. These are agreements, these are contracts between the city and utility providers that permit the use of the city's right-of-way. Typically, these agreements last for about 10 to 20 years, possibly longer. Franchise fees are not permitted on electricity, natural gas, or telephone providers per state law. Cable TV franchise agreements are governed by federal law with a maximum rate of 5% of gross revenues. And the city assesses a 5% rate of Comcast gross revenues. For for the biennial 2021 and 22, that amounted to a little over $500,000. Impact fees. These are charged to developers to mitigate the impacts on infrastructure and capital facilities due to the increased demand resulting from new development. They're permitted on streets, parks, schools, and fire. Oak Harbor has them on streets and parks. These revenues must be expended or encumbered within 10 years of receipt unless there is a, quote, extraordinary and compelling reason for fees to be held longer. And these fee amounts are determined by rate studies that are adopted by City Council. For 21 and 22, we're looking at about $250,000. And I believe we did discuss in previous City Council meeting that we will be taking a closer look at the impact fees in the near future and come to the City Council with their findings. System development fees. These fees are developed to recover the fair share of the cost of additional sewer and water capacity facilities needed by increased use. Whenever a new water meter is installed or an existing meter is replaced by a larger one, the system development fee is charged. And if it's replaced, it'll be the difference between the size of the current meter and the new one. And we are currently studying our water utility rates, and it will include the system development fees as well. The marina. The marina revenues consist of user fees to recover the cost of operating and maintaining the city's marina. The city's marina is an enterprise fund, which is considered a government-operated business-type enterprise by the state auditor and the generally accepted, GASB, the Government Accounting Standards Board, which does provide government accountants generally accepted accounting principles to utilize when they do their financials and other accounting activities. Operating costs, projects, and user fees are reviewed by the city's Marina Advisory Committee, and they make a recommendation to the City Council on increases or decreases to user fees. And the City Council ultimately reviews and adopts the marina budget, marina projects, and fees. For the biennial for 21 and 22, the revenues budgeted are approximately $3.3 million, maybe 3.4 if you round up. Senior services. These consist of user fees to partially recover the cost of operating and maintaining the senior center facility and activities. It is a special revenue fund, which is used to account for and report revenues restricted for specific purposes and or report a specific government activity. So you can see that the adopted biennial is just over $220,000. 2021 due to COVID was much reduced, but as you can see, the budget was put at the same level as it was in 2020 in order to accommodate the reopening and activities that will be occurring as was before the pandemic emergency. Public safety, there are about 25 fees and charges in various categories. This includes partial cost recovery, such as the school resource officer funds from the Oak Harbor School District and EMS services from Whitby General. We also have detention and probation services, criminal and infraction penalties and fees, public defense revenues, and fire permits and animal license and control. For the biennial 2021-22 biennial, it looks like about $550,000 was budgeted. And then utilities. This is the largest source of revenue for the city. These revenues consist of user fees to recover the costs of operating and maintaining the city's water, wastewater, stormwater, and solid waste activities. For the biennial, you can see that we're looking at adding that together. Looks like $49 million for the biennial. And Navy is charged as well for water per a separate agreement with the cities. So the fee amounts are determined by a rate study, which we have a consultant looking at now. And that rate study is brought to the city council for deliberation and eventual adoption. Transfers and interfund charges. This category consists of money moving between funds based on state auditor approved costs allocation methodologies or actual expense allocations. The city's internal services funds, which receive these funds, consists of the vehicle repair fund, our equipment replacement fund, our facility replacement fund, our technology replacement fund, and our shop facility funds. And the total of these interfund charges look like around a little bit over $15 million over the biennial. And then we have miscellaneous revenues. These are highly variable in nature due to the nature, due to the nature of the revenues. We have interest earnings, which depend on the economy, and last year, interest earnings were pretty poor. And for the first few months of this year, they've been pretty poor as well, but things are improving on that front. Sale of fixed assets. It just depends on the amount and type of assets for sale during a particular year. And also donations and developer contributions. That depends on outside funders and development activity. So you can see how it varies. It goes up, goes down, goes up. It all depends on what happened in that particular year. And these numbers, of course, are budgeted numbers, so we'll be able to get a better look at what actually happened when we close the books on 2021 and submit to the state auditor. So that covers all the revenues the city has. The next area are resources, and that resources includes all the revenue recovered, but it also includes fund balances, reserves, and interfund transactions. So first we have fund balances, and those are defined by the state auditor and GASB. There are 5 categories for governmental funds in the annual financial report. We have the unspendable category, prepaids and deposits. We have the restricted category. Those are fund balances that must be used for specific purposes, and those purposes are stipulated by the Constitution, legislation, or external resource providers such as REIT, Transportation Benefit District impact fees. Committed, those can only be used for specific purposes determined by formal action by the City Council. Assigned are fund balances that can only be used for specific purposes, but they do not meet the criteria of restricted or committed. And then unassigned is everything else. So we have an item in the budget called budgeted fund balance. Cities are required to budget unencumbered resources. Accounts called beginning fund balance in governmental funds or beginning net position in proprietary funds are included in the budget to satisfy that requirement. The amounts are estimated during the biennial budget process, and they're trued up during the mid-biennial budget process. Reserves, those are set by council actions, city policy, and/or tracking. The general fund has a 2-month or 16 2/3% of operating budget reserve requirement. Enterprise funds have a 3-month or 25% of operating budget reserve requirement. Solid waste and storm drain funds were reduced to 20% in 2020 per ordinance 1899. I think that ordinance was also the ordinance that approved the current utility rates. So specific reserves, the general fund. The general fund has a revenue stabilization fund, which is 10% of the operating budget. This is a reserve requirement to mitigate the effects of revenue shortfalls or budgetary imbalances. As of the end of 21, that was end of 20 actually, that was 1.57 million. Now that revenue stabilization fund was reduced from 25% in 2018, and that difference was used for various purposes as allocated by the City Council. About just under $1 million of that amount remains, and it stays in the reserve until City Council directs us to utilize it for various purposes. We have a capital facilities reserve of $500,000 to mitigate an infrequent or catastrophic event. We have a sleeper road proceeds reserves and that's reserved for park projects. We have about $160,000 left on that. And then we have the American Rescue Plan Act reserve. That is to be used for eligible projects and initiatives as approved by City Council. The first tranche of funds was just under $3.3 million. The council has allocated most of those funds, and spending is underway. And we will be providing updates on the spending and the project status as we go along through the year. The Senior Center Fund. There's $40,000 of senior center endowment funds, and those are to be used for maintenance and operations, and those have not been utilized in the past few years. Those would require City Council action to utilize those funds. And the Marina Funds, we have a $257,000 general obligation dredging bond reserve that was set at 10% of the previous refunded bond amount from 2012. So the formula that calculates the beginning fund balance in each of the funds is as follows. You take the total resources. Total resources equals cash and estimated revenues throughout the end of the year. And you subtract total commitments. That would be the unspendable, the committed, the restricted or assigned fund balance, any reserves, and then any estimated expenditures and commitments throughout the end of the year. So from that, we were able to calculate what our beginning fund balance would be for each of the funds during the mid-biennial process for the beginning of 2022. So using the general fund as an example, the total resources for the general fund, cash and equivalent, was just under $11 million, adding about $6 million for estimated revenues throughout the end of the year, because we did this calculation, I think in October, or maybe September, but one of those 2 months, and we had to estimate the revenues for the rest of the year. And the total for that was $16.648 million. Then we would subtract out the total commitments, meaning the fund balances and reserves. And then we would estimate the expenditures and commitments through the end of the year to get a total of $13.1 million. And subtracting 16.6 from 13.1 equals 13.5. And that is the amount. And I know this is hard to read, but this was in the package that was approved by City Council on December 7th, 2021 for the mid-biennial budget amendment. And you can see the different items that are located here. That's the amended amount, and like I showed on the previous slide, 3.53. You can barely see that for the general fund is 3.53, and that's compared to what was originally put in the budget. And the difference is the amendment that would be needed to true up the budget, and that was done for each one of these funds. And then, nearing the end, we have interfund transactions. These are transfers between funds that balance out with each other. These are typically used to fund capital projects or transfer to a centralized debt service fund. For 2021 and 22, we had $6.9 million and $6.8 million budgeted for interfund transactions. And that concludes the Finance and Budget Primer Part 1B. We have some upcoming primers for the City Council. We have expense categories and details. We have project funding and budgeting, and we have investments. And we'll probably have others as we delve deeper into the city's finance and budget items. So with that, I'm available, or staff's available to field any questions you may have.
So I'll turn to council at this time. Councillor Stuckey.
Where were you when I was getting my business degrees? Just one question: the interfund transfers. So, for example, like the arts fund, which comes from utilities, is that money moved over on a yearly basis, or is that like a monthly or quarterly? Like the moving from one fund to another, how often does that happen in general?
It goes directly in there. It doesn't actually get moved between funds. So when somebody pays the bill, it automatically goes to the utility tax. 6% of it goes to the utility funds, and 0.25% of it goes into the arts fund.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Anyone else? So I have a question, Mr. Goldman, and as it pertains to interfund charges and the percentage, I'm not going to say I was surprised, but maybe just a little bit at that percentage. Do we compare that with other cities? Have we do that? And if so, or if not, could we? I mean, I would assume that other cities do interfund charges, and I'm just
Oh, yeah.
I'm curious.
Yeah, we can do that. We can take a look at some other budgets and see how we compare, for sure.
Okay, if we haven't done that, I think I'd like to see that. We do a lot of other comparisons, and that's just I'm curious about that because I know it's an active, it's certainly active, interfund transfers are, so. Okay, any other questions about that? Yes, Councilor Hoffmeyer.
The one thing on there that did surprise me, David, was the gambling tax, how much lower we were than the other Washington cities. Usually, I'm not a proponent of increasing taxes. However, and it looks like it wouldn't be a substantial amount of money. But if we were to bring that to match what the other cities are, more in line with those, if we could use that to offset, rate impacts, et cetera, throughout the city. Just an idea on that. I'm assuming that's part of the reason that those numbers are there.
Yeah, it was just informational for the city council to consider, for sure.
Councilor Wiesner.
Thank you, Mayor. Mr. Hoffmeyer, I will tell you that that was something we were involved in just a couple of years ago. We looked at this, and the reality is social card games came down to one business in our city, and that business came in and very specifically showed us his books, explained to us his margins, and said he would close his doors. And so, therefore, there'd be no revenue generated from it. Same thing with punch boards and pull tabs. I think there was 4 businesses, maybe 5 in the city at that time that it affected. A couple of them were things like the VFW, the Fleet Reserve, which are semi nonprofits. And then the same thing with the raffles. We started looking at, okay, where would that revenue come off of? Who holds the raffles in the community, and who would end up paying that tax? And it was going to be coming from the nonprofits. And we even sat down and looked at it. If we did take them all to the 5%, it was a matter of a few $1,000s. It wasn't a whole big pool of money. And so, we had several tavern owners, bar managers, the manager of the social card room in here speaking to the taxes, and they were very transparent with the margins that they made on those things. And some of the punch board folks said, the margins were making, they would just probably quit selling them. It's such a small portion of their business. And then again, we actually looked at, I think at one time, and the revenue was going to go backwards if we raised the tax based upon some of the input we had, if I remember correctly, Mr. Oberon. So
Yeah, certainly this is a great opportunity for, in preparation of the budget. I know we focus on the expenditure side, and that certainly is a major component of it, but knowing options on the revenue side just gives you more opportunity. So with B&O tax, talked about that. I know I was a little frustrated because we had a revenue opportunity to increase revenue for the gambling tax, and then we turned around and increased our expenditures for police with no additional revenue when we're hitting fund balance, which is not sustainable. So certainly looking at that opportunity and weighing it together, we can put it all on the expenditure side, but I just certainly from a policy point of view, you need to know all your options. And I know other cities I've been at, we looked at revenue sources and made that part of the budget process as options. So this gives you a better picture here, and I think we'll get some more picture here on the interfund issue, but David did give you some good opportunities and did discussion there on B&O taxes and other revenue sources. And I was told like our utility tax, I'm not advocating for it, I mean, but there's cities up there that are in the 20%. Our two major revenues are capped, which is property tax and sales tax, and they are what they are. But there's certainly other opportunities we have if you wanted to provide additional services and wanted to look at that opportunity.